Hello, and welcome back to Storytime Classics Live, produced by Southwest Shakespeare Company. I am your host for the ghost, and that ghost is Rebecca. And reading Rebecca today will be our guest reader, Amy Bjorklund. Welcome, Amy. How are you today? And where are you coming to us from?
I am fantastic, thank you. And I am reading today from beautiful Northern California.
Excellent. Oh, wish we were all there. That's beautiful.
It's pretty fantastic, yes.
Excellent. You've been with Southwest Shakespeare for a little while. What are some of the things that you've done with the company?
My first show was in 2013 when we used to do Springfest and Winterfest. So I did Gertrude and Hamlet, and then Margaret in Much Ado. They ran in rep for a couple weeks. And then in 2018, I did Sense and Sensibility with Patrick Walsh directing. And then in 2019, I directed Taming of the Shrew. And then for 2 years, worked as the project manager on the office side of things. So Awesome. If you ever bought tickets for a show between 18 and 19 before we shut down in 20, I have met you. And welcome back.
We have all missed.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, so a little bit of trivia there. Have you ever read Rebecca?
I have not read it. No, I have seen the 1940s film. Yeah, Excellent. Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So I teach the film. I have seen the film, and I'm very excited to watch the new Netflix film because I love the cast. And so, yeah, I am a lover of the story. I'm a lover of the genre, very much so. I think female mystery writers, this is kind of their heyday. This is, Agatha and Daphne. Yeah. But this is our first. And then I think we're also starting to really find people, writers of color and female writers of color that are writing in this time and maybe not as celebrated. So it's just such a great introduction to this genre of female writers, and women mystery writers I think they're amazing. Like, they're intricate and they're interesting and they're smart and
yes.
Oh,
Most definitely. Excellent. I will encourage that during the broadcast, all comments about the piece about Rebecca are encouraged. Discussion and just general comments about it. I love this novel. That's great. Comment on that. Feel free to do that. If you would like to start a discussion about things that happen later in the book, that'd be great. If you've read the book, please kind of keep it to yourself and don't no spoilers. Basically, no spoilers. And so just have fun with this. And I turn things over to you, Amy, and take us into the world of Rebecca.
Yes, the spooky music commences. So this is the version I'm reading from. This is the most recent one with some editor notes and author notes. This is also the one they re-released for when Netflix's movie, gotta market yourselves. And then also, Bo and I were chatting before we start reading. I'm bringing out my very time-specific glass and there's a little note from my grandmother. This was a wedding gift to her from 1945. So I figured it was very appropriate to drink water as I talk, not from a plastic water bottle, but very Rebecca-esque crystal glassness. So off we go. Here we are. I will not be reading in an English accent, so I know it is set in Cornwall in the Cornish mountains, but I will be reading it in Amy accent. Chapter 1. Last night, I dreamt I went to Manderley again. It seemed to me I stood by the iron gate leading to the drive, and for a while I could not enter, for the way was barred to me. There was a padlock and a chain upon the gate. I called in my dream to the lodge keeper, and had no answer. And peering closer through the rusted spokes of the gate, I saw that the lodge was uninhabited. No smoke came from the chimney, and the little lattice windows gaped forlorn. Then, like all dreamers, I was possessed of a sudden with supernatural powers, and passed like a spirit through the barrier before me. The drive wound away in front of me, twisting and turning as it has always done. But as I advanced, I was aware that a change had come upon it. It was narrow and unkempt, not the drive that we had known. At first I was puzzled and did not understand. And it was only when I bent my head to avoid the low swinging branch of a tree that I realized what had happened. Nature had come into her own again, and little by little, in her stealthy, insidious way, had encroached upon the drive with long, tenacious fingers. The woods, always a menace even in the past, had triumphed in the end. They crowded, dark and uncontrolled, to the borders of the drive. The beeches with white, naked limbs leant close to one another, their branches intermingled in a strange embrace, making a vault above my head like the archway of a church. And there were other trees as well, trees I did not recognize, squat oaks and tortured elms that strangled cheek by jowl with the beeches and had thrust themselves out of the quiet earth, along with monster shrubs and plants, none of which I remembered. The drive was a ribbon now, a thread of its former self, with the gravel surface gone and choked with grass and moss. The trees had thrown out low branches, making an impediment to progress. The gnarled roots looked like skeleton claws. Scattered here and again amongst this jungle growth, I would recognize shrubs that had been landmarks in our time, things of culture and of grace, hydrangeas whose blue heads had been famous. No hand had checked their progress, and they had gone native now, rearing to monster height without a bloom, black and ugly as the nameless parasites that grew beside them. On, now east, now west, wound the poor thread that had once been our drive. Sometimes I thought it lost, but it appeared again, beneath a fallen tree perhaps, or struggling on the other side of a muddied ditch created by the winter rains. I had not thought the way too long. Surely the miles had multiplied, even as the trees had done, and this path led but to a labyrinth, some choked wilderness, and not to the house at all. I came upon it suddenly, the approach masked by the unnatural growth of a vast shrub that spread in all directions, and I stood, my heart thumping in my breast, the strange prick of tears behind my eyes. There was Manderley. Our Manderley, secretive and silent, as it has always been, the gray stone shining in the moonlight of my dream, the mullioned windows reflecting the green lawns and the terrace. Time could not wreck the perfect symmetry of those walls, nor the site itself, a jewel in the hollow of a hand. The terrace sloped to the lawns, and the lawns stretched to the sea. I could see the sheet of river placid under the moon, like a lake undisturbed by wind or storm. No waves would come to ruffle this dream water, and no bulk of cloud, wind driven from the west, obscure the clarity of this pale sky. I turned again to the house, and though it stood inviolate, untouched, as though we ourselves had left but yesterday, I saw that the garden had obeyed the jungle law, even as the woods had done. The rhododendrons stood 50 feet high, twisted and entangled with bracken, and they had entered into alien marriage with a host of nameless shrubs, poor bastard things that clung about their roots as though conscious of their spurious origin. A lilac had mated with a copper beech, and to bind them yet more closely to one another, the benevolent ivy, always an enemy to grace, had thrown her tendrils about the pair and made them prisoners. Ivy held a prior place in this lost garden. The long strands crept across the lawns and soon would encroach upon the house itself. There was another plant, too, some half-breed from the wood, whose seed had been scattered long ago beneath the trees and then forgotten, and now, marching in unison with the ivy, thrust its ugly form like a giant rhubarb towards the soft grass where the daffodils had blown. Nettles were everywhere, the vanguard of the army. They choked the terrace, they sprawled about the paths, they leant, vulgar and lanky, against the very windows of the house. They made indifferent sentinels, for in many places their ranks had been broken by the rhubarb plant, and they lay with crumpled heads and listless stems, making a pathway for the rabbits. I left the drive and went on to the terrace, for the nettles were no barrier to me, a dreamer. I walked enchanted, and nothing held me back. Moonlight can play odd tricks upon the fancy, even upon a dreamer's fancy. As I stood there, hushed and still, I could swear that the house was not an empty shell, but lived and breathed as it had lived before. Light came from the windows. The curtains blew softly in the night air, and there, in the library, the door would stand half open as we had left it, with my handkerchief on the table beside the bowl of autumn roses. The room would bear no witness to our presence. The little heap of library books marked ready to return, and the discarded copy of the Times, ashtrays with the stub of a cigarette, cushions with the imprint of our heads upon them lolling on the chairs, the scarred embers of our log fire still smoldering against the morning. And Jasper, dear Jasper, with his soulful eyes and great, sagging jowl, would be stretched upon the floor, his tail a thump when he heard his master's footsteps. A cloud, hitherto unseen, came upon the moon and hovered an instant like a dark hand above a face. The illusion went with it, and the lights in the windows were extinguished. I looked upon a desolate shell, soulless at last, unhaunted, with no whisper of the past about its staring walls. The house was a sceptre. Our fear and suffering lay buried in the ruins. There would be no resurrection. When I thought of Manderley in my waking hours, I would not be bitter. I should think of it as it might have been could I have lived there without fear. I should remember the rose gardens in summer and the birds that sang at dawn, tea under the chestnut tree, and the murmur of the sea coming up to us from the lawns below. I would think of the blown lilac and the happy valley. These things were permanent. They could not be dissolved. They were memories that cannot hurt. All this I resolved in my dream, while the clouds lay across the face of the moon, for like most sleepers, I knew that I dreamed. In reality, I lay many hundred miles away in an alien land, and would wake, before many seconds had passed, in the bare little hotel room, comforting in its lack of atmosphere. I would sigh a moment, stretch myself in turn, and open my eyes, be bewildered at that glittering sun, that hard, clean sky so different from the soft moonlight of my dream. The day would lie before us both, long, no doubt, and uneventful, but fraught with a certain stillness, a dear tranquility we had not known before. We would not talk of Manderley. I would not tell my dream, for Manderley was ours no longer. Manderley was no more. Chapter 2. We can never go back again. That much is certain. The past is still close to us. The things we have tried to forget and put behind us would stir again, and that sense of fear, of furtive unrest, struggling at length to blind, unreasoning panic, how now mercifully stilled, thank God, might in some manner, unforeseen, become a living companion as it had been before. He is wonderfully patient and never complains, not even when he remembers, which happens, I think, rather more often than he would have me know. I can tell by the way he will look lost and puzzled suddenly, all expression dying away from his dear face as though swept clean by an unseen hand, and in its place a mask will form, a sculptured thing, formal and cold, beautiful still, but lifeless. He will fall to smoking cigarette after cigarette, not bothering to extinguish them, and the glowing stubs will lie around on the ground like petals. He will talk quickly and eagerly about nothing at all, snatching at any subject as a pansy at a pane. I believe there is a theory that men and women emerge finer and stronger after suffering, and to advance in this or any world we must endure ordeal by fire. This we have done in full measure, ironic though it seems. We have both known fear and loneliness and very great distress. I suppose sooner or later in the life of everyone comes a moment of trial. We all of us have had our particular devil who rides us and torments us, and we must give battle in the end. We have conquered ours, or so we believe. The devil does not ride us anymore. We have come through our crisis, not unscathed, of course. His premonition of disaster was correct from the beginning, and like a ranting actress in a different play, I might have said that we have paid for freedom. But I have had enough melodrama in this life and would willingly give my 5 senses if they could ensure us our present peace and security. Happiness is not a possession to be prized. It is a quality of thought, a state of mind. Of course, we have our moments of depression, but there are other moments too, when time, unmeasured by the clock, runs on into eternity, and catching his smile, I know we are together. We march in unison. No clash of thought or of opinion makes a barrier between us. We have no secrets now from one another. All things are shared. Granted that our hotel is dull and the food indifferent, and that day after day dawns very much the same, yet we would not have it otherwise. We should meet too many of the people he knows in any of the big hotels. We both appreciate simplicity, and if we are sometimes bored, well, boredom is a pleasing antidote to fear. We live very much by routine, and I have developed a genius for reading aloud. The only time I have known him to show impatience is when the postman lags, for it means we must wait another day before the arrival of our English mail. We have tried wireless, but the noise is such an irritant, and we prefer to be stored up in our excitement. The result of a cricket match played many days ago means much to us. Oh, the test results that have saved us from ennui, the boxing bouts, even the billiard scores, finals of schoolboy sports, dog racing, strange little competitions in the remoter counties. All these are grist to our hungry mill. Sometimes old copies of The Field come my way, and I am transported from this indifferent island to the realities of English spring. I read of chalk streams, of the mayfly, of sorrel growing in green meadows, of rooks circling above the woods as they used to do at Manderley. The smell of sweet earth comes to me from those stumbled and tattered pages, the sour tang of moorland peat, the feel of soggy moss spattered white in places by a heron's droppings. Once there was an article on wood pigeons, and as I read it aloud, it seemed to me that once again I was in the deep woods of Manderley, with pigeons fluttering above my head. I heard their soft, complacent call, so comfortable and cool on a hot summer's afternoon, and there would be no disturbing of their peace until Jasper came loping through the underground to find me, his damp muzzle questing the ground. Like old ladies caught at their ablutions, the pigeons would flutter from their hiding place, shocked into silly agitation, and making a monstrous to-do with their wings, streak away from us above the treetops and so out of sight and sound. When they were gone, a new silence would come upon the place, and I, uneasy for no known reason, would realize that the sun no longer wove a pattern on the rustling leaves, that the branches had grown darker, the shadows longer, and back at the house there would be fresh raspberries for tea. I would rise up from my bed of bracken then, shaking the feathery dust of last year's leaves from my skirt, and whispering to Jasper, set off towards the house, despising myself even as I walked in my hurried feet, my one swift glance behind. How strange that an article on wood pigeons would so recall the past and make me falter as I read aloud. It was the gray look on his face that made me stop abruptly and turn the pages until I found a paragraph on cricket, very practical and dull, Middlesex battling on a dry wicket at the Oval and piling up intermittent dreary runs. I blessed those stolid, flannelled figures, for in a few minutes his face had settled back into repose, the color had returned, and he was deriding the Surrey bowling on the healthy irrigation. We were saved a retreat into the past, and I had learnt my lesson. Read English news, yes, and English sports, politics, and pomposity, but in future keep the things that hurt to myself alone. They can be my secret indulgence. Color and scent and sound, rain and the lapping water, even the mists of autumn and the smell of the flood tide, these are memories of Manderley that will not be denied. Some people have a vice of reading Bradshaws. They plan innumerous journeys around the country for the fun of linking up impossible connections. My hobby is less tedious, if as strange. I am a mine of information on the English countryside. I know the names of every owner of every British moor, yes, and their tenants, too. I know of how many grouse are killed, how many partridge, how many head of deer. I know where trout are rising and where the salmon leap. I attend all meets. I follow every run. Even the names of those who walk hound puppies are familiar to me. The state of the crops, the price of fat cattle, the mysterious ailments of swine, I relish them all. A poor pastime, perhaps, and not a very intellectual one, but I breathe the air of England as I read and can face this glittering sky with greater courage. The scrubby vineyards and the crumbling stones become things of no account, for if I wish I can, I give rein to my imagination and pick foxgloves and pale champions from a wet, streaking hedge. Poor whims of fancy, tender and unharsh, they are the enemy to bitterness and regret and sweeten this exile we have brought upon ourselves. Because of them, I can enjoy my afternoon and return, smiling and refreshed, to face the little ritual of our tea. The order never varies. 2 slices of bread and butter each, and China tea. What a hide-bound couple we must seem, clinging to custom because we did so in England. Here, on this clean balcony, white and impersonal with creatures of sun, I think of 4:30 at Manderley, and the table drawn before the library fire, the door flung open, punctual to the minute, and the performance never varying of the laying of the tea, the silver tray, the kettle, the snowy cloth, while Jasper, his spaniel ears adroop, feigns indifference to the arrival of the cake. That feast was laid before us always, and yet we ate so little. Those dripping crumpets, I can see them now. Tiny, crisp wedges of toasts and piping hot, flaky scones. Sandwiches of unknown nature, mysteriously flavored and quite delectable, and that very special gingerbread. Angel cake that melted in the mouth, and his rather stodgier companion bustling with peel and raisins. There was enough food there to keep a starving family for a week. I never knew what happened to it all, and the waste used to worry me sometimes, but I never dared ask Miss Danvers what she did about it. She would have looked at me in scorn, smiling that freezing, superior smile of hers, and I can imagine her saying, "There were never any complaints when Mrs. De Winter was alive. Mrs. Danvers, I wonder what she is doing now." She and Flavel. I think it was the expression on her face that gave me my first feeling of unrest. Instinctively, I thought, she's comparing me to Rebecca. And sharp as a sword, the shadow came between us. Well, it is over now, finished and done with. I ride no more tormented, and none of us are free. Even my faithful Jasper has gone to the happy hunting grounds, and Manderley is no more. It lies like an empty shell amidst the tangle of deep woods, even as I saw it in my dream. A multitude of weeds, a colony of birds. Sometimes, perhaps, a tramp will wander there, seeking shelter from a sudden shower of rain, and if he is stout-hearted, he may walk there with impunity. But your timid fellow, your nervous poacher, the woods of Manderley are not for him. He might stumble upon a little cottage in the cove, and he would not be happy beneath its tumbled roof, the thin rain beating a tattoo. There might be a linger, there might be a certain atmosphere of stress. That corner in the drive, too, where the trees encroach upon the gravel, is not a place in which to pause, not after the sun has set. When the leaves rustle, they sound very much like the stealthy movement of a woman in evening dress. And when they shiver suddenly and fall, scatter away along the ground, they might be the patter-patter of a woman's hurrying footsteps, and the mark on the gravel the imprint of a high-heeled satin shoe. It's when I remember these things that I turn with relief to the prospect from our balcony. No shadows steal upon this hard glare. The stony vineyards shimmer in the sun, and the bougainvillea is white with dust. I may one day look upon it with affection. At this moment, it inspires me, if not with love, at least with confidence. And confidence is a quality I prize, although it has come to me a little late in the day. I suppose it is his dependence upon me that has made me bold at last. At any rate, I have lost my diffidence, my timidity, my shyness with strangers. I am very different from that self who drove to Manderley for the first time, hopeful and eager, handicapped by a rather desperate gauchier and filled with an intense desire to please. It was my lack of poise, of course, that made such a bad impression on people like Mrs. Danvers. What must I have seemed like after Rebecca? If I could see myself now, memory spanning the years like a bridge, with straight bobbed hair and youthful, unpowdered face, dressed in an ill-fitting coat and skirt and a jumper of my own creation, trailing in the wake of Mrs. Van Hopper like a shy, uneasy colt. She would precede me into lunch, her short body ill-balanced upon tottering high heels, Her fussy, frilly blouse, a compliment to her large bosom and swinging hips, her new hat pierced with a monster quill assailant upon her head, exposing a wide expanse of a forehead bare as a schoolboy's knee. One hand carried a gigantic bag, the kind that holds passports, engagement diaries, and bridge scores, while the other hand toyed with that inevitable lingerie, the enemy of other people's privacy. She would make for her usual table in the corner of the restaurant, close to the window, and lifting up her lorgnette to her small pig eyes, survey the scene to right and left of her, then would let the courgette fall at length upon its black ribbon and utter a little exclamation of disgust. Not a single well-known personality. I shall tell the management they must make a reduction in my bill. What do you think I come here for? To look at the page boys? And she would summon the waiter to her side, her voice sharp and staccato, cutting the air like a saw. Ugh. How different the little restaurant where we eat today to that vast dining room, ornate and ostentatious, the Hotel Côte d'Azur à Monte Carlo. And how different my present companion, his steady, well-shaped hand peeling a mandarin in quiet, methodical fashion, looking up and again from his task to smile at me. Compared to Mrs. Van Hopper, her fat, bejeweled fingers questing at a plate heaped high with ravioli, her eyes darting suspiciously from her plate to mine for fear I should have made the better choice. She need not to have disturbed herself, for the waiter, with the uncanny swiftness of his kind, had long sensed my position as inferior and subservient to hers, and had placed before me a plate of ham and tongue that somebody had sent back to the cold buffet half an hour before as badly carved. Ah, that resentment of servants, and their obvious impatience. I remember staying once with Mrs. Van Hopper in a country house, and the maid never answered my timid bell, or brought up my shoes, or early morning tea was stone cold, dumped outside my bedroom door. It was the same at the Côte d'Azur, though a lesser degree, and sometimes the studied indifference turned to familiarity, smirking and offensive, which made buying stamps from the reception clerk an ordeal I would avoid. How young and inexperienced I must have seemed, and how I felt it, too. One was too sensitive, too raw. There were thorns and pinpricks and so many words that in reality fell lightly on the air. I remember well that plate of ham and tongue. It was dry and unappetizing, cut in a wedge from the outside, but I had not the courage to refuse it. We ate in silence, for Mrs. Van Hopper liked to concentrate on food, and I could tell by the way the sauce ran down her chill that her dish of ravioli pleased her. It was not a sight that endangered me in any great appetite for my own cold choice. And looking away from her, I saw that the table next to ours, left vacant for 3 days, was to be occupied once more. The maitre d'hotel, reserved for his more special patrons, was ushering the new arrival to his place. Mrs. Van Hopper put down her fork and reached for her lorgnette. I blushed for her while she stared, and the newcomer, unconscious of her interest, cast a wondering eye over the menu. Then Mrs. Van Hopper folded her lorgnette with a snap, leant across the table to me, her small eyes bright with excitement, her voice a shade too loud. "It's Max de Winter," she said, "the man who owns Manderley. You've heard of him, of course. He looks ill, doesn't he? They say he can't get over his wife's death." Chapter 3. I wonder what my life would be today if Mrs. Van Hopper had not been a snob. Funny to think that the course of my existence hung like a thread upon that quality of hers. Her curiosity was a disease, almost a mania. At first I had been shocked, wretchedly embarrassed. I would feel like a whipping boy who must bear his master's pains while I watched people laugh behind her back, leave a room hurriedly upon her entrance, or even vanish behind a service door in the corridor upstairs. For many years now, she had come to the Hotel Côte d'Azur and had, apart from bridge, her one pastime, which was notorious by now in Monte Carlo, to claim visitors of distinction as her friends, had but she seen them once on the other end of the post office. Somehow she would manage to introduce herself, and before her victim had scented danger, she had proffered an invitation to her suite. Her method of attack was so downright and sudden that there was seldom opportunity to escape. At the Côte d'Azur, she staked a claim upon a certain sofa in the lounge, midway between the reception hall and the passage to the restaurant, and she would have her coffee there after luncheon and dinner, and all who came and went must pass by her. Sometimes she would employ me as bait to draw her in her prey, and hating my errand, I would be sent across the lounge with a verbal message, the loan of a book or paper, the address of some shop or other, the sudden discovery of a mutual friend. It seemed as though notables must be fed to her, much as invalids are spooned their jelly, and though titles were preferred by her, any face once seen in a social paper served as well. Names scattered in the gossip column, authors, artists, actors, and their kind, even the mediocre ones, as long as she had learnt of them in print. I can see her as though it were yesterday, on that unforgettable afternoon, never mind how many years ago, when she sat on her favorite sofa in the lounge, debating her method of attack. I could tell by her abrupt manner and the way she tapped her lorgnette against her teeth that she was questing possibilities. I knew, too, when she had missed the sweet and rushed through dessert, and she had wished to finish her luncheon before the new arrival and so install herself where he must pass. Suddenly, she turned to me, her eyes small alight. Go upstairs quickly and find that letter from my nephew. You remember, the one written on his honeymoon with the snapshot? Bring it down to me right away. I saw then her plans were formed, and the nephew was to be the means of introduction. Not for the first time, I resented the part that I must play in her schemes. Like a juggler's assistant, I produced the props, then, silent and attentive, I waited on my cue. This newcomer would not welcome intrusion. I felt certain of that. In the little I had learnt of him at luncheon, a smattering of hearsay garnered by her 10 months ago from the daily papers and stored in her memory for future use, I would imagine, in spite of my youth and inexperience in the world, that he would resent this sudden bursting upon in his solitude. Why he should have chosen to come to the Côte d'Azur at Monte Carlo was not our concern. His problems were his own, and anyone but Mrs. Van Hopper would have understood. Tact was a quality unknown to her. Discretion, too. And because gossip was the breath of life to her, this stranger must be served for her dissection. I found the letter in a pigeonhole in her desk and hesitated a moment before going down again to the lounge. It seemed to me, rather senselessly, that I was allowing him a few more moments of seclusion. Oh, I wish I had the courage to go by the service staircase and so by roundabout way into the restaurant, and there warn him of the ambush. No, convention was too strong for me, though, nor did I know how I should frame my sentence. There was nothing for it but to sit in my usual place beside Mrs. Van Hopper while she, like a large, complacent spider, spun her wide net of the stranger's person. I had been longer than I thought, for when I returned to the lounge, I saw he had already left the dining room, and she, fearful of losing him, had not waited for the letter, but had risked a bare-face introduction of her own. He was even now sitting beside her on the sofa. I walked across to them and gave her the letter without a word. He rose to his feet at once, while Mrs. Van Hopper, flushed with her success, waved a vague hand in my direction and mumbled my name. Mr. De Winter is having coffee with us. Go and ask the waiter for another cup, she said, her tone just casual enough to warn him of my footing. It meant I was a youthful thing and unimportant, and there was no need to include me in the conversation. She always spoke in that tone when she wished to be impressive, and her method of introduction was a form of self-protection. For once I had been taken for her daughter, an acute embarrassment for us both. This abruptness showed that I could be safely ignored, and women could give me a brief nod, which served as a greeting and dismissal in one, while men, with large relief, would realize they could sink back into the comfortable chair without offering courtesy. It was a surprise, therefore, to find that this newcomer remained standing on his feet, and it was he who made a signal to the waiter. I'm afraid I must contradict you, he said to her. You are both having coffee with me. And before I knew what happened, he was sitting on my usual hard chair, and I was on the sofa beside Mrs. Van Hopper. For a moment she looked annoyed. This is not what she had intended. But soon she composed her face, and thrusting her large self between me and the table, she leant forward to his chair, talking eagerly and loudly, fluttering the letter in her hand. You know, I recognized you just as soon as you walked into the restaurant, she said, and I thought, why, there's Mr. De Winter, Billy's friend. I simply must show him those snaps of Billy and his bride taken on their honeymoon. And here they are. This Dora, isn't she adorable? That little slim waist, those great big eyes. Here they are sunbathing at Palm Beach. Billy is crazy about her, you can imagine. He had not met her, of course, when he gave that party at Claridge and where I saw you first. But I dare say you don't remember an old woman like me. This with a provocative glance and a gleam of teeth. On the contrary, I remember you very well, he said. And before she could trap him into a resurrection of their first meeting, he handed her his cigarette case, and the business of lighting up stalled her for a moment. I don't think I should care for Palm Beach, he said, blowing out the match, and glancing at him, I thought how unreal he would look against a Florida background. He belonged to a walled city of the 15th century, a city of narrow, cobbled streets and thin spires, where the inhabitants wore pointed shoes and worsted hose. His face was arresting, sensitive, medieval in some strange, inexplicable way, and I was reminded of a portrait seen in a gallery I had forgotten where of a certain gentleman unknown. Could one but rob him of his English tweeds and put him in black, with lace at his throat and wrists, he would stare down on us in our new world from a long, distant past. A past where men walked cloaked at night and stood in the shadow of old doorways. A past of narrow stairways and dim dungeons. A past of whispers in the dark, of shimmering rapier blades, of silent, exquisite courtesy. I wished I could remember the old master had painted that portrait. It stood in a corner of the gallery, and the eyes followed one from the dusky frame. But they were talking, though, and I had lost the thread of conversation. No, not even 20 years ago, he was saying. That sort of thing has never amused me. I heard Mrs. Van Hopper give her fat, complacent laugh. If Billy had been at home like Mannerly, he would not want to play around in Palm Beach, she said. I'm told it's like a fairyland. There's no other word for it. She paused, expecting him to smile, but he went on smoking his cigarette, and I noticed, faint as a gossamer, the line between his brows. I've seen pictures of it, of course, she persisted, and it looks perfectly enchanting. I remember Billy telling me that it had all those big places beat for beauty. I wonder you could ever bear to leave it. His silence now was painful and would have been patent to anyone else, but she ran on like a clumsy goat, trampling and trespassing on land that was preserved, and I felt the color flood from my face, dragged with her as I was into humiliation. Of course, you Englishmen are all the same about your homes, she said, her voice becoming louder and louder. You deprecate them so as to not seem proud. Isn't there a minstrel's gallery at the Mannerley and some very valuable portraits? She turned by way of explanation. Mr. De Winter is so modest he won't admit to it, but I believe that lovely home of his has been in the family's possession since the conquest. They say that minstrel's gallery is a gem. I suppose your ancestors often entertained royalty at Mannerley, Mr. De Winter? This was more than I had hitherto endured, even from her, but the swift flash of his reply was unexpected. Not since Ethelred, he said, the one who was called Unready. In fact, it was while staying with my family that the name was given him. He was inevitably late for dinner. She deserved it, of course, and I waited for her to change face. But incredible as it may seem, his words were lost on her, and I was left to writhe in her stead, feeling like a child that had been smacked. Oh, is that so? She blundered. I had no idea. My history is very shaky, and the kings of England always muddled me. How interesting, though. I must write and tell my daughter. She is a great scholar. There was a pause, and I felt the color flood back into my face. I was too young, and that was the trouble. Had I been older, I would have caught his eye and smile, her unbelievable behavior making a bond between us. But as it was, I was stricken into shame and endured one of the frequent agonies of youth. I think he realized my distress, for he leant forward in his chair and spoke to me, his voice gentle, asking if I would have more coffee. And when I refused and shook my head, I felt his eyes were still upon me, puzzled, reflective. He was pondering my exact relationship to her and wondering whether he must bracket us together in futility. What do you think of Monte Carlo? Or don't you think of it at all, he said. This including of me in the conversation found me at my worst. The raw ex-schoolgirl, red-elbowed and lank hair, and I'd said, something obvious and idiotic about the place being artificial, but before I could finish my halting sentence, Mrs. Van Hopper interrupted. She's spoilt, Mr. De Winter. That's her trouble. Most girls would give their eyes for the chance of seeing Monty. Wouldn't that rather defeat the purpose? He said, smiling. She shrugged her shoulders, blowing a great cloud of cigarette smoke into the air. I don't think she understood him for a moment. I am faithful to Monty, she told him. The English winter gets me down, and my constitution just won't stand it. What brings you here? You're not one of the regulars. Are you going to play chimmy, or have you brought your golf clubs? I've not made up my mind, he said. I came away in rather a hurry. His own words must have jolted a memory, for his face clouded again, and he frowned very slightly. She babbled on, impervious. Of course you miss the fogs of Manderley. It's quite another manner. The West Country must be delightful in the spring. He reached for the ashtray, squashing his cigarette, and I noticed the subtle change in his eyes, the indefinable something that lingered there momentarily, and I felt I had looked upon something personal to himself with which I had no concern. Yes, he said shortly, Manderley was looking its best. A silence fell upon us, during a moment or two, a silence that brought something of discomfort in its train. And stealing a glance at him, I was reminded more than ever of my gentleman unknown, who, cloaked and secret, walked a corridor by night. Mrs. Van Hopper's voice pierced my dream like an electric bell. I suppose you know a crowd of people here, though I must say Monty is very dull in this winter. One sees so few well-known faces. The Duke of Middlesex is here on his yacht, but I haven't been aboard yet. She never had, to my knowledge. You know Nell Middlesex, of course, she went on. What a charmer she is. They always say the second child isn't his, but I don't believe it. People will say anything, won't they, when a woman is attractive? Oh, and she is so very lovely. Tell me, is it true that the Caxton-Hyslop marriage is not a success? She ran on, though through a tangled fringe of gossip, never seeing that these names were alien to him. They meant nothing, and that as she prattled unaware, he grew colder and more silent. Never for a moment did he interrupt or glance at his watch. It was though he was set himself a standard of behavior, since the original lapse for when he had made a fool of her in front of me, and clung to it grimly rather than offend her again. It was a page boy in the end who released him, with the news that a dressmaker awaited Mrs. Van Hopper in the suite. He got up at once, pushing back his chair. Don't let me keep you, he said. Fashions change so quickly nowadays. They may have even altered by the time you get upstairs. The sting did not touch her. She accepted it as a pleasantry. It's so delightful to have run into you like this, Mr. De Winter, she said as we went toward the lift. Now I've been brave enough to break the ice. I hope I shall see something of you. You must come and have a drink sometime in the suite. I may have one or two people coming on tomorrow evening. Why not join us? I turned away so I could not watch him search for an excuse. I'm sorry, he said. Tomorrow I am probably driving to Sospel. I'm not sure when I'll get back. Reluctantly, she left it, but we still hovered in the entrance to the lift. I suppose they've given you a good room? The place is half empty, so if you're uncomfortable, mind you make a fuss. Your valet has unpacked for you, I suppose. This familiarity was excessive even for her, and I caught a glimpse of his expression. I don't possess one, he said quietly. Perhaps you would like to do it for me? This time his shaft had found its mark, for she reddened and laughed a little awkwardly. Why, I hardly think, she began. Then suddenly and unbelievably she turned upon me. Perhaps you could make yourself useful to Mr. De Winter if he wants something done. You're a capable child in many ways. There was a momentary pause while I stood stricken, waiting for his answer. He looked down on us, mocking, faintly sardonic, a ghost of a smile on his lips. A charming suggestion, he said, but I cling to the family motto. He travels the fastest who travels alone. Perhaps you have not heard of it. And without waiting for her answer, he turned and left us. Oh, what a funny thing, said Mrs. Van Hopper as we went upstairs in the lift. Do you suppose that sudden departure was a form of humor? Men do such extraordinary things. I remember a well-known writer once who used to dart down the service staircase whenever he saw me coming. I suppose he had a penchant for me and wasn't sure of himself. However, I was younger then. The lift stopped with a jerk. We arrived at our floor. The page boy flung open the gates. By the way, dear, she said as we walked along the corridor, Don't think I mean be unkind, but you put yourself in just a teeny bit forward this afternoon. Your efforts to monopolize the conversation quite embarrassed me, and I'm sure it did him. Men loathe that sort of thing. I said nothing. There seemed no possible reply. Oh, come, don't sulk, she laughed and shrugged her shoulders. After all, I am responsible for your behavior here, and surely you can accept advice from a woman old enough to be your mother. Eh bien, dans, eh bien. And hummed a tune. She went down the bedroom where the dressmaker was waiting for her. I knelt on the window seat and looked out upon the afternoon. The sun shone very brightly still, and there was a gay high wind. In half an hour, we should be sitting to our bridge, the windows tightly closed, the central heating turned to the full. I thought of the ashtrays I would have to clear, and how the squashed stubs, stained with lipstick, would sprawl in company with discarded chocolate creams. Bridge does not come easily to a mind brought up on Snap and Happy Families. Besides, it bored her friends to play with me. I felt my youthful presence put a curb upon their conversation, much as a parlor maid does until the arrival of dessert, and they could not fling themselves so easily into the melting pot of scandal and insinuation. Her men friends would assume a sort of forced heartiness and ask me jocular questions about history or painting, guessing I had not long left school, and this would be my only form of conversation. I sighed and turned away from the window. The sun was so full of promise, and the sea was whipped white with a merry wind. I thought of that corner in Monaco where I had passed a day or two, and where a crooked house leant into a cobbled square. High up in the tumbled roof there was a window, narrow as a slit. It might have held a medieval presence, and reaching into the desk for pencil and paper, I sketched in fancy with an absent mind a profile, pale and angling, a somber eye, a high-bridged nose, a scornful upper lip, and I added a pointed beard and lace at the throat, as the painter had done long ago in a different time. Someone knocked at the door, and the lift boy came in with a note in his hand. Madam is in the bedroom, I told him, but he shook his head and said it was for me. I opened it and found a single sheet of notepaper inside, with a few words written in an unfamiliar hand. Forgive me. I was very rude this afternoon. That was all. No signature, no beginning, but not my name was on the envelope and spelt correctly, an unusual thing. Is there any answer? Asked the boy. I looked up from the scrawled words. No, I said. No, there isn't any answer. When he had gone, I put the note away in my pocket and turned once more to my pencil drawing, but for no known reason it did not please me any more. The face was stiff and lightless, and the lace collar and the beard were like props on a charade. Let's see how many pages on this chapter, because we have 13 minutes left. Oh, this is a long one. Okay, so I think we might save this for next because it's 14 pages, and that's going to get us way past our hour mark. So thank you for joining me. I'm going to drop my fantastic bookmark. I will see all of you on chapter 4 in next time, which I believe is next Tuesday. Thank you so much. Again, Amy Bjorklund through Southwest Shakes. I am very much enjoying this. I'm intrigued to see where we go next. And I will see you on the flip side. Have a fantastic day. Bye.